Hello there. My name is Annabelle Kale, but if you're watching this video, you probably already knew that, because there's a good chance you were here for my SUNY Potsdam Presidential Scholars presentation. Either way, if you don't know who I am, I'm surprised you found this video, as I don't have a lot of subscribers. But the purpose of this video is essentially to walk through my process in physically hands-on studying the process of small-scale textile production, spinning and weaving specifically, in, I guess, early colonial America has been my specific focus. First things first, I apologize if the audio is not great. I was gonna use my good microphone, but she was being really temperamental today. So I've put her away and we're just gonna deal with whatever my iPhone picks up. And I've got some caffeine, because it's kind of late right now, with my little ramshackle film setup that I've got here in the basement with my little spread of fiber goods. Now, if you are from my presentation, you'll probably recognize most of these. Of course, I still wanted to have them out, because while the research paper that I shared focuses on the academic subject with my argument about misogyny and its role in our perceived gender divide in historical sewing and textile production practices, this was more of the hands-on stuff that I did. So I'm gonna just start from the beginning and go play by play of my process of learning here, basically. This was originally going to be a vlog. When I started this project, I was like, it would be really cool to just vlog my process of learning this. And then I was really bad about doing that. And part of it is, if you've never filmed something, filming something makes it take like 3 times as long, because you have to set up the camera, you have to make sure it's at a good angle. You also, okay, you don't have to do this, but generally it's like, when I'm working on my fiber art stuff, it was like late at night, and I was like not wearing makeup, and like my hair wasn't done, or my hair was like wet because I just got out of the shower and I was in like, comfy, ugly pajama clothes. And it's like, you don't necessarily have to look presentable to be on camera, but I personally felt better about it. So it was like, sometimes it was like the choice between, going through all the effort to look quote unquote presentable for filming or to feel comfortable being on camera versus just getting the work done. I tended to opt for getting the work done and then filming a little bit facelessly after the fact. So you'll notice a lot of the clips I will be, because I did film stuff like throughout the course of this project, which was about 2 years. I did film stuff, but not to the degree that I could just stitch it together and be like, vlog time. It's kind of just clips of me being like, oh, this is what my workboard looks like, or just like a photo here and there, that sort of thing. Not cohesive enough. So I was like, you know what? Let me just sit down and talk through the process, and then I can take what footage and photos I have and like intersperse them. Yeah, let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start, as one very wise Julie Andrews once said. So this all started, this particular journey started in summer of 2023. I should preface at least that I have always had an interest in historical sewing and textile practices. In fact, it's kind of the reason I'm studying history at SUNY Potsdam by the time you're watching this video, I will have concluded my history degree. I will have graduated as an early graduate in December, or at least I'll be like a week from there, basically. But one of the reasons that I have been studying history is because of my interest in clothing history and dress history and that sort of thing, that was kind of spurred on by YouTube historians like Bernadette Banner and Abby Cox, Nicole Rudolph, and at times Rachel Maxey, and I think it was one of those things where I'd just never kind of seen that kind of history be presented in the same academic and respectable manner as something like war history, which again, I love me a good World War I doc, don't get me wrong, but something like that will always be taken seriously. Something like this hasn't always been, and I think that was something like, oh wait, I could study about the cutting of silks and gowns and the shape of dresses, and like that is a respected academic subject. Anyways, this particular journey, this chair is so squeaky. This particular journey started in, I want to say July of 2023. So I was staying at my grandparents' during that summer, and for a little extra bit of context, their house has been in our family since it was built in 1837, give or take. So one really cool thing is that the cousin who owned the house before he passed away and left it to my grandparents was really, really interested in family genealogy and history, and my grandma's been kind of picking up the work there, doing all sorts of history in our family, and so we know a lot about the people there, but also he was really good about maintaining records. I guess keeping stuff is the best way that I can phrase it. Like if you could see the house, it's like it looks like a museum in a lot of ways, like on the back porch, you know, hanging from the walls and from the ceiling. There's all these antique baskets and antique farm equipment, and it's really, really cool. I love it. I love it there. We were exploring through the barn one day, the attic of the barn, and we found, in frankly gorgeous condition for being in a barn for probably a few hundred years, a spinning wheel, which I now know it's a flax wheel or a linen wheel because of its smaller size. It was sometimes what it was used for, but you can use different spinning wheels of different sizes for any function. So as you can see, it's not in like perfect working condition. Actually, it's not in working condition at all. I really wanted it to be. I got some people to look at it and they were like, this would not spin very well. And I was like, but it's still very important, as that was sort of the catalyst for my interest in this. And I was like, oh my God, like my direct ancestors were doing these like small scale fiber arts practices here on this land, you know? My grandpa later found a weaving shuttle, like well polished on the edges, like, so clearly they had weaving looms and spinning wheels and were producing fiber. Like it was likely that they had sheep on the land, and they were making what I now know is referred to as homespun yarn. I was texting a friend of mine about it who was in the history department, and they were like, hey, you should apply for Presidential Scholars. And I was like, well, what's Presidential Scholars? And they were like, it's basically this research grant program that is, you know, fairly prestigious that the school puts on, where you are basically like, I want to learn a thing or I want to do a thing. And you present the outline of your project and your timeline or whatever to the people in charge of the program. And then they either say, yes, that sounds really cool, here's $1,800. Or they say, sorry, this doesn't seem very well thought out, here's $0. I was like, that sounds really amazing. Think of what I could do to learn about this with $1,800. Which, you know, if you are like an adultier adult than me, you're probably like, wow, that's not very much money. And it's not. I know that now. I want to say a mistake I made when starting this project. I don't want to say it was a mistake. I want to say it was a thing that I learned. Let's rephrase this. A thing that I learned. A thing that I am constantly learning about myself is that I am really optimistic when I start things. I'm like that guy from the movie Christmas Vacation who like builds things up in his head to be like really incredible and fantastic, and then when I actually complete them, I'm like, I didn't meet a whole lot of those barriers, and frankly they were really unrealistic benchmarks in the first place. And I think that that's something that I kept hitting over and over with this project, where I was like, my original goals were borderline insane and not reachable at all, and I don't really know what I was thinking. But I think for the sake of like learning and understanding, I'm going to walk you guys through my thought process of what I thought I could accomplish in 2 years while also being a full-time college student studying 2 majors, one of which was music, with a whole lot of performance study, with a lot of hobbies, and usually maxed out credit hours. I don't think I've ever had less than like 18 credit hours a semester, if I'm being honest. I was at 20 this semester. It was really rough. So I thought that I was going to be able to, it's going to start out realistic and get further outlandish, right? Learn to spin, learn to weave, spin a bunch of wool, build a weaving loom using a combination of modern and historical methodology, weave several bolts of full-size cloth, make a nice dress to wear for the presentation. In 2 years, I thought I was going to be, like, if I had nothing going on but this, and, you know, had maybe planned a little bit better and had an entirely different personality than the one that I currently possess, yeah, maybe that could have been possible, you know, I think for somebody else, but I don't know why I thought I was going to be able to do that, frankly. What I ended up being able to do, and then I'll go back chronologically. What I ended up doing was learning how to spin on a spinning wheel. Super cool, by the way. Super cool. Learning how to spin on a drop spindle, which I'll demonstrate for you in a second. All this like yarn here is stuff that I've spun myself. Went to a weaving school in Vermont for a week and took a class on historical weaving methods, complete with all these insane resources and documents. I mean, holy crap, Justin Squizzero. Crazy work. They go by the Newbury School of Weaving. I went when it was still the Marshfield School of Weaving, and they've since moved locations to be a little bit further east, and I will talk about them more in a second. Learned a whole ton about that, and like, you know, helped make some fabric, which, you know, this one I've got framed because it's really gorgeous. And these are all based off of like historical drafting patterns. This one was actually off of like a physical blanket that was found in a church, like an extant blanket from historical times, colonial America. Oh, that's good stuff. And then I came back, bought this weaving loom you can see in the foreground here, fixed it up using modified and MacGyvered historical method, by which I mean, because the historical method that I learned, the knitted heddles is like the big thing, and like the method of warping, was on huge barn looms, right? Which I don't have space for that, right? I'm a student. I'm also gonna be honest with you, Marshfield took up my entire budget. All of my budget went to that. So, you know, because I traveled for a week and the school itself is fairly expensive. So, you know, it wasn't really like I had the ability to then be like, oh, and let's also get a giant weaving loom for this space on campus, you know. So I decided to focus small scale first. I also wanted to focus small scale first because I don't know why I thought this was gonna be easy. I really don't. I don't know why in my head I was like, this is gonna be so simple. I'm just gonna like fix it up and like recreate flawlessly these complex historical practices that took teams of people on a full-size thing, you know, on this little thing using, I will show it to you in a couple minutes, but basically paint stirrers and masking tape. Because, you know, an actual craftsman would have, you know, properly made specific tools built and designed for this, and I bought this tape loom for 20 bucks in an antique ball, and I have the materials available to me. So anyways, that's the expectation versus the reality of what actually happened. And I think that most research projects are like this. But you don't just learn about the thing, you learn about yourself, and you learn about your own way of viewing the world, understanding the world, and, you know, working with it. And I think that's a lot of what I did, is I didn't just learn about weaving and spinning, I also learned about my own methods of research. So let's start with spinning, actually. I love it. It's relaxing, actually. So I learned to spin 2 different ways. That following summer, through a connection, we have a friend at the local museum near my grandparents' house, the Hammond Museum. It's really great, actually, if you are into Scottish things at all. They do a yearly Scottish festival that has gotten really, really big. I remember when it was just like a little, you know, thing with tents, and now it's huge. They get so many people, even from like out of state. It's crazy. Anyways, so we're sort of family friends with the museum director, and she connected me with someone else who used to teach spinning, like locally. So I connected with her and was basically like, hey, can you like show me how to spin? She's the one actually who took a look at my grandparents' spinning wheels, basically like, this is not functional, BT dubs. But she lent me a full-size spinning wheel from a very kind woman who passed away but really loved spinning, and she was like, I think she'd love that, you know, someone was getting, you know, some use out of it for a little bit since I'm no longer teaching spinning classes. And so she let me borrow it after showing me how to use it, of course. It's so cool. And I'm kicking myself because I didn't take any videos. I had this thing for like weeks. Like I had it for like a month or so at least. I was just like spinning nonstop because it's soothing. Like especially in summer. Like it's nice and warm, and like you get the trail going and it's just like you're rocking along. One of the pieces of advice I got from a ton of people, because another thing that I did was I also reached out to local museums and kind of talked about like my interest in weaving and spinning, and was kind of like, hey, any ideas on where I should go for this, you know? And, you know, any advice, etc. And I was told by a lot of people, like, always keep the first yarn you spin because you'll never be able to spin like that again. And it's true. God, this is so ugly. This isn't the first, but this is, I think, one of the first. And like, yeah, this looks terrible, but I'm never gonna be able to spin like this again because now my stuff looks like this. Isn't that beautiful? Anyway, so she was really kind enough to lend me a spinning wheel for a while, and she used to have sheep, and she was like, she produced so much wool. I have so much wool. She was like, I don't like have enough wool to like physically, feasibly use by myself. So she gave me like this huge bag was overflowing with wool. I've spun a bunch of it now. I still have some left, like a year and a half later. And it's nice too. I mean, it was all like, you know, combed and cleaned. That is one thing that I never learned how to do, was to process a fiber from the source. I only learned how to work with it from cleaned and combed and carded state. I also only learned how to work with wool, and this was another piece of advice that was given to me by a lot of people. Because at first I was like, oh, well, the wheel that my grandparents have in their barn is a linen wheel, and so I want to learn linen. And if you know anything about spinning or weaving, you're probably like screaming right now. And you're right, because linen is apparently notoriously finicky. You know, it's like learning how to sew on like silk taffeta or like silk organza. It's notoriously finicky. You have to spin it wet. You have to. It's terrible. So everyone was like, no, spin on wool. Spin on wool. It's also easier to get a hold of, if I'm being honest. And so one of the interesting reasons for that is because wool on like a molecular, not even molecular. That's not even the word I wanted. Microscopic level. Let me get a little bit out for you. Wool has like tiny little hooks on the outside, and so it sticks to itself really easily. So even if you just kind of take a little bit in your fingers and like, you know, spin it, you will end up with like a little fiber strand because it just loves to stick together. You know, this is gonna unspin immediately, but that's one of the benefits of having a wheel or a drop spindle is it adds tension. So I have one picture, and it's this selfie here that I took while I was spinning. But trust me when I say that it's really cool. I could have sworn I took videos of it. I don't know what happened, honestly. Well, anyways, you know, I gave that back to her, and she was like, you know, come back and use it anytime. I ended up not, because I ended up getting this. Now, drop spindles are really cool. And I did do, you know, a good amount of research on like types of spinning wheels. Somewhere I have a book on spinning wheels that I was reading extensively through. It was originally for like collectors, but there was also just like a lot of interesting information in it. And the interesting thing about the drop spindle is almost the way that almost every culture has a sword or like a fried donut thing in their culture. Almost every culture also has a drop spindle. It's just like, it's notoriously simple technology, very intuitive, and yields you functional results, which is string, yarn, thread, whatever the thickness of it you end up with. So the weight of it also sort of changes depending on what you're working. So I was working with wool, so I wanted a heavier one. The heavier ones are also easier to work with. So this is a huge roll of wool that I've got here, but I just kind of like threw this on here to kind of show you. But basically what happens is you connect it to, what's it called? The leading thread? Leading thread? Leading strings? It's something like that is the technical term. And you just kind of like, you know, spin it to connect it to it. Because again, wool sticks to itself. It will just stick to itself. And this downward motion from gravity kind of pulls the tension downwards so that it doesn't coil back up in itself. So then this part up here is called the drafting triangle. And that basically just ensures that I have this nice, like, fine pull of wool. And these are some things that I learned from this very lovely lady who was doing demonstrations at the Scottish Festival on, oh my god, what is it called? A pendulum wheel. A pendulum wheel is, frankly, one of the coolest things I've ever seen in my life. It's not functional. It's not something that I would ever learn on. I mean, maybe someday, right? But it's basically super, super rare because they were only produced for like a very short period of time in like the late 1860s when, you know, manufacture was kind of the hit thing for threads and stuff anyways. And, you know, if people were doing spinning, it was more of a hobby thing, or it was in really rural areas, but it was originally designed as something that was beneficial for like amputees. Now maybe it was like the 1870s. It was like they were only produced for like 2 years in like one state in the Midwest and in like Ithaca, New York. And so they're incredibly rare because a lot of times, so they have a counterweight, a pendulum that would like balance out the twisting motion, as opposed to a normal great wheel. You would need both hands basically. And so it was like friendly for amputees or people who might struggle with a typical wheel, but a lot of the pendulums were like melted down for parts because it's a hunk of metal that's more functional as bullets, I guess, during later years is the going theory. Really cool stuff though. Anyways, so that nice lady I was speaking to was showing me a little bit about some of the drop spindles in her collection and showing me how they work and that sort of thing. So I ended up buying this one. They're frankly all the same. You just have like a weight and a spindle to hold it. You could make a really simple one with like a rock and a stick, which I'll be honest, I haven't experimented with that too much, but there's probably a ton of tutorials out there. I'm gonna be honest, the weaving is one of those things that I would happily do in a workshop again. You know, if I took another class, it's really cool in a class, it's really cool with lots of other people. The spinning, I do it in class. Like, I do it as like a fidget toy almost. Listen, you can ask any of my professors. I'm usually sitting in the corner spinning wool. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it. Now that, like, because I've wove with it, that was my big goal, was I want to weave a textile using, I mean, you know, my altered goal down from my insane dreamer goal was I want to be able to have a textile made from wool that I spun myself using semi-historical methods adapted to fit this tiny table loom. And so now I don't know what I'm gonna do with all this yarn and thread that I spun, but I have a lot of friends who knit and crochet, so I might end up like just giving some of it away because I like the spinning, but I don't actually do a lot of yarn crafts, which is kind of funny. Anyway, so the spinning it's delightful. It's incredibly intuitive. It's very easy. It's very simple. If you were at my presentation, there's a good chance that I'm probably going to demonstrate a little bit and let people, you know, feel the yarn. So that's kind of, part of my goal for the spinning was just I want to just spin as much as possible. So I just was spinning lots in classes and that sort of thing with my drop spindle. It's great. And I'll insert a picture of it here. A 3D printed niddy nani. That was one of the cool things, is involving, I feel like there's wool all over me, was involving the 3D printing lab on campus. Because I was like, you know what, if I'm sort of MacGyvering my tools here, I should involve modern technology like 3D printing. Now, the weaving portion. I should have scripted this. What was I thinking? I'm too chaotic for this. The weaving. So, I read some book chapters and some articles and stuff about weaving, but it's honestly such a huge topic because almost every culture has a type of weaving, and again, this was like sort of a fault of mine that I recognized a little too late in the project, was that I wasn't focused enough with the books and articles that I'd chosen on specifically colonial the United States and like Western Europe was kind of my focus. And so a lot of the stuff I was like, yeah, here's how it started 10,000 years ago. And I was like, oh, really cool. Maybe not super helpful for me now that I'm looking back. So I think in a lot of ways my really full understanding of it came from Marshfield, now Newbury, School of Weaving. Because I also think that weaving, spinning, sewing, other practical crafts are one of those things that you can only fully understand if you are learning it in the same way that people of the past learned it. If you want to do it in a historical manner, you have to learn it in a historical manner, if that makes sense. There's evidence to suggest this, that in a lot of ways, the education of the past was based around trades and apprenticeships. And so the way that people thought about things was physical, was hands-on, right? They didn't always study abstract concepts the same way that we do. So when it came to like doing math, you were doing, I mean, a lot of the weaving stuff, dude, I was in over my head for part of it. I was like, this is really complex stuff mathematically. But it was all like, this was stuff that just like tradesmen were doing a few hundred years ago because it was like part of their craft, part of their work, basically. And it was like you learned it as its application to weaving looms and to understanding draft books and draft patterns and how to weave certain things, not as an abstract concept. So it was one of those things that I was like, I just have to get my hands on a loom. I just have to better understand this. Marshfield, now Newbury. I'm gonna keep calling it Marshfield because it was Marshfield when I went, and so it's like in my head I was like, I went to the Marshfield School of Weaving, but it does now go by Newbury School of Weaving. So I'm probably just gonna call it the Marshfield School of Weaving and Marshfield functionally, but just know that I mean the Newbury School of Weaving if that's something that you're interested in attending. So anyways, it was recommended to me by several people because I guess for the East Coast and New England, Mid-Atlantic, this is kind of like the place to go if you want to learn historical weaving practices and, you know, other stuff. They do dyeing and spinning and stuff like that. It's really cool. I'd love to go back, you know, when I have like the time and resources to. Because it was kind of expensive. I think it was like $1,000 for the class itself. It was like $1,000. So, you know, for me it was kind of like, okay, no brainer, let's go to Marshfield, right? Seems like the hip place to be for people who want to learn about weaving. They had a couple of classes available. There was beginner weaving, and then there was this new course that they'd never done before called Weaving Interrupted, and it was basically like a historical look at weaving. And I was like, well, that seems perfect for me. But I was like, I've never woven before. And I know it says in the description that like people of all skill levels are accepted, but like if I've never like been in the same room as a weaving loom before, if this is something pretty foreign to me, am I gonna be in over my head? So I did end up emailing, I think it was Justin Squazzaro that I ended up emailing. I think he's the new director, if I understand correctly, and he was the one teaching this particular class. Very cool dude. Very cool dude. Oh my god, would love to take another class with him, or even just like pick his brain again. Like, wow. And so I did email, I was like, hey, I'd love to take this class, and I'm looking like taking this class for this particular research project that I've been doing. But I've never woven before. Am I gonna be in over my head? And he was like, we would be happy to have you. And I was like, sounds good. So I filled out the paperwork and I was like, okay, I would like to go to this very expensive. I ended up having to request more money actually to cover the trip. It was pricey, but it was, oh my god. I don't even have the words to describe what an incredible experience this was. Frankly, because, and I do have some clips from this that I'll like insert in like a little montage here. But basically, it's a week-long course. It was like a Sunday or Saturday night. I forget, because I think I literally like left my Dairy Queen job that evening and drove into Vermont. It's just outside of Montpelier is where the old location was. So it was like, 4 hours. I got there in the evening, and I stayed at the Marshfield Inn and Motel, because it was literally down the path from the school. So like if you were looking for a place to stay, that is the place to stay, right? It was just like Monday through Friday, like full-time hours basically. It was insane. It was so cool. And again, I'm gonna try and like montage here, because part of me was like, oh, I really want to vlog this. This is gonna be such a cool experience. But then part of me was like, if I have my phone out or my camera out, I don't want to seem rude, and I do really want to seem as like absorbed as possible in this incredible experience that I'm having right now. So I took some pictures, some videos, and some pictures and videos were taken of me that, I'll kind of montage here in a second. But yeah, basically I took the ferry across to outside Burlington, and then I drove to Montpelier, and and then it was like a week in the August heat in the attic of this barn, basically. But it was, oh my god, it's this gorgeous historic building. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this. It's this gorgeous historic building. And again, it's not there anymore, which is very sad, because that's kind of where it was for like, you walk in and it was like this gorgeous old building, and it's like there's like corners full of like spinning wheels and winding wheels and all sorts of stuff, and a little old-timey kitchen, and you head up the stairs, and in the attic there's just, it's like wall-to-wall looms. It was like really cool seeing all these things that I've been like reading about in an abstract sense come to life in this physical reality. And I was with this group of like 10-ish other ladies. Day one was just spent poring over like documents, like primary source documents. This course was like 10 years worth of research and study on the practice of historical weaving, basically. And it was like his big thesis was the way that we understand historical weaving was founded in like the early 1900s and isn't actually historical practice. And so he had gone through and basically like looking at like old draft books, old manuals, old like trade books, sort of things like that, looking at like physical blankets and artifacts, and just basically being like, I think that this is the way that you're supposed to do it. And he had managed to find all these diagrams and like a handful of video and photography from the modern day here and there, from like a handful of places that were still doing it the actual old way. And then he was like, okay, we're gonna like study the crap out of this, and then this week we're gonna put it into practice on multiple projects. And he was like, and you guys are kind of my guinea pigs, because he was like, I've never done this before with, this is the first run of the class basically. So I was in over my head a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. I was it an insane and incredible oh my god, yeah, I wouldn't trade it for the world. I mean, first of all, traveling like that on my own I've been freshly 20 was really, it's super exciting. And then getting to like work on these projects with these women, I mean, it was just like insane. It was so cool. And like, but I was a little bit in over my head, because it took me till like Wednesday, like late Tuesday or Wednesday, to fully understand the function of the weaving loom. I don't think we started weaving until like late Wednesday or Thursday morning, like it, because so much of it, and this is another thing that I hadn't considered, so much of weaving is the prep work. So much of weaving is spinning, fiber prep, winding the yarn, setting it up on a warp board, learning how to warp it, actually warping the loom, and then like preparing hooking everything up to the different treadles, and then figuring out the patterns, and like oh my god, I mean, there was so much. The actual weaving patterns we didn't do till like the very last day. A lot of the tools we were working with were actually antiques. which was a little scary because some of them were a little spindly. The Swifts that we were using were like, they kept breaking, and it was like scary because I was like, oh my god, this thing is like 150 or more years old. How old is it? How many times has this been used? And like, how is it still functional? So we worked with, I think it was 3 different projects. It was like 3 or 4. There were a couple, but I have samples from 3. So one was wool, which was, and I have it framed because it's beautiful, and I like framing things as art. I could take it out, but I don't feel like it. So this was like goose eye quilt, not quilt, but goose eye blanket basically. And this was a really cool pattern to work on. I hope you can see. Because as you can see, it's got that little diamond pattern in it. And that was basically made through hanging underneath weaving looms. There's all these like treadles underneath, right? And so you had to like push those in a particular pattern. And it is very like, it is repetitive. And like once you get into it, you get into it. The warping was also, I guess, different from how you do it now with like modern weaving practices. Even if it's considered traditional, like this was Justin's whole thing, is like the way that we understand things is different, and it's not actually historical, it's traditional, which is not the same. And so one of the things was the warping pattern, which was so difficult, and I still don't think I have it down, which is why some of the textiles that I've made are kind of weird looking. I don't think I really mastered it. But again, it's hard because I don't have the tools that they had there. I'm kind of MacGyvering it here a little bit, which is another issue. I hadn't quite considered how difficult it would be to work without the proper tools, but it's fine. And so the warping is basically, you had this like board hanging, and you would like pull the threads and like weave through them, and then you would get this like cross pattern that you would like put onto pegs and then like wrap around, and it would like go back and then wrap around. You would do that like several times until you had like the correct width of threads across that would go onto the thing. And then getting that onto the loom was a crazy affair, because the barn looms, if you've ever seen a barn loom, you'll see them in a second with the montage that I keep referring to, but that I likely haven't put in yet. I don't know when editing version of me is going to do that. Those are huge, and you need an insane amount of tension to get the threads to warp tightly, right? Because if they're not like taut, then you won't get a proper weave. Like it won't look like this, it'll look like a sad lumpy mess. And so there are all these stories about like that he was sharing with us that he like found, where you would have like a whole team of men like basically pulling on the bundle of threads while another team of men like rolled it into place, which crazy, right? Like, oh my god. And like that, and that was another thing that he kept kind of like driving home, was like, this was a very communal thing. Like this was done by groups of people, this was done in workshops, this was done in craft shops. And honestly, a lot of the research projects and study that I've done on that involve like craft history, a lot of what we think nowadays about like the individual craftsperson is just like not always true. A lot of times these things were done in guilds or in craft shops, and weaving was no exception. At least in older times. In colonial America, sometimes it was like an isolating thing, but sometimes it was also a family thing, And that was another thing that was remarked by a lot of the women who I was working with, especially ones who had done classes at Marshfield before, were like, wow, this is so nice. Like, I feel like I've never gotten to talk to the other like people in the class before. Usually we're very isolated and working on our own projects. And I was like, yeah, I wouldn't have anything to compare this to, but I'm having a great time. So warping was like a major thing. But then another thing was the heddles. I sure didn't know what heddles were 2 years ago, but I do now. So how do I explain this? When you put the threads on the loom, something has to hold them in like this and then like this, so that you get the actual crossing pattern, if that makes sense. So that you get the actual, like, you get what I'm saying, like there needs to be some movement of threads, basically. And heddles, again, it's hard because I didn't see a single modern loom while I was there. I don't actually have anything to compare it to. And again, that's another gap in my research, that I should have looked a little bit more at actual modern traditional looms and like compared those. All I really know is the historical stuff, which on one hand, maybe that's a benefit, right? I don't have anything to like compare it. I don't have anything to compare it to when I was doing the work, because a lot of the weavers commented that it was really hard to unlearn their previous like weaving study and, you know, adapt to this new style of doing things. But for me, I was like, well, it's also hard because I don't know what I'm doing at all. But the heddles, it's basically what the threads go through that kind of holds them. It pulls them in different patterns. And Justin was basically like, I found so much evidence that they used to be made out of this complicated, like, knitting. They were called knitted heddles, and they were made out of this complicated knotting pattern, and found all these diagrams and stuff that he shared with us that I'll put here. And so we spent also a huge chunk of time making those. And when I say we, I didn't actually do a ton of work on these. There were a couple ladies who got into a solid rhythm. And so it's like, there are a couple ways to do them, but one of the ways that we ended up, again, it was mostly a couple of ladies who were doing this, and I didn't do it very much. It's, you have this particular jig, and again, we're working with an antique one that's set up with like a dowel in the middle, and then you like have these little like shuttles that you kind of pass back and forth in this knotting pattern, and you do that, and again, that's so many eyelets, basically. It creates an eye hole in the middle that the thread is supposed to pass through. And again, that creates so many of those that you're then also supposed to match up with the amount of threads and with the amount of holes in the metal beater. We used reed beaters. That was also really stressful because it was, oh, these are like several hundred years old and really fragile, so don't break them. But we're gonna use them to weave with. And it was like, that's like the thing you beat down on the thread with, basically, which was really cool. And so a lot of it was math, actually. Really, really complicated math that actually nobody fully understood, including like Justin and some of the really experienced ladies, because it was one of those things that it was like, all we had to look at were the drafting patterns in these old like books meant for weavers who were used to these patterns, and we had to basically be like, okay, based on this, we have to use this many threads across, we have to warp it this many times, and then we have to, you know, put it on the loom, and then sometimes there were like multiple sets of heddles, and you had to know based on, okay, we have, you know, say, for example, but there's more than this, for example, 40 eyelets in each of these 4 heddles sets. We have 120 strings, maybe 400 whatever in the reed beater, and a pattern to make. How do you divide these threads between these 4 heddles in a way that won't create damaging string tension, and in a way that will effectively create the pattern that you're trying to recreate based on these documents? And it would explain it to you, but again, it was like explaining this thing that we had like very little concept of, because we were, you know, it was such a like foreign function. And for things like this, and this we used with, it's called sized cotton, and so it has this like stiffening on it, which I think some people washed it off. I ended up just leaving it on because I think it's kind of cool. It's kind of crunchy still, which that was also kind of, this was awful to work with. I'm not gonna lie, weaving on this was terrible because the shuttle kept getting stuck and then like falling through. It was like, it was so horrible. But like for something like this, or even for the goose eye, it's like, it's mostly just like, okay, you want this many red and this many white, this many red, this many white. Or like this one was just like an even check pattern for the warp that you just would pull through in an even pattern. But what was really difficult that I have in this here envelope to figure out with the knitted heddles, there was this one particular, and it was called the diaper draft. Diaper meaning diamond, right, is an old term for diamond. I definitely giggled inside a little bit every time we used that term. But basically, there was this one that nobody could get a handle on. There was one particular lady who was working on it up till like late Friday afternoon, trying to get like a handle on the threading pattern, and we thought she got it. At least I thought she did. But then this very lovely lady who I gave a ride to the airport, like after the school had concluded, she ended up getting my address and mailed me a little bit of a completed sample of the diaper draft, which was so sweet of her. Like, she did not have to do that, but she sent me a little note, basically, you know, wishing me good luck on my project, and like, and so this, I'll try and get it closer. Look at how unbelievably intricate that is. Can you imagine, with the process I've just described, trying to figure out that pattern? Certainly beyond my comprehension. That it's not something that I could possibly understand, frankly, but I guess somebody else had been really hell-bent on understanding and finishing it, and had like come back for a different class and like realized that it was threaded wrong, undid all that, redid it correctly somehow, and had woven like a good amount of it. And my nice friend sent me some, which is very lovely because it's gorgeous. I mean, that's incredible. The intricacy in the pattern, you know? And it's like, it's really hard to comprehend that like nowadays that's all done by machine. Somebody had to think about it at some point for sure, but then now we don't really think about the insane skill and complexity that goes into creating something like that. I mean, holy crap, dude, that's a hell of a process. Pardon my French. And I think, you know, I've always been someone who's like, I think that we need to have a better understanding of the process of clothing and textile making, because that's why people treat clothing so cheaply nowadays, not just with fast fashion, but with like, you know, throwing things away and not mending things and not caring for things, is because I think that we lack fundamentally an understanding of just how complicated and intense these processes can be. You know, I mean, for hundreds of years, this was a trade that people did. I'm not going to say people made their own clothes, because they didn't. That's fundamentally not true. And if you read my paper, you'll understand a little bit more about that. But there's also some really good resources I can recommend in the comments down below if you're interested. But anyways, so the weaving school was insane. Again, it was like, I both learned so much and also left feeling like I had more questions than answers. Constantly torn between this is the most incredible thing I've ever experienced in my life, and also like, what is happening right now? And then in the end, cool things with fabric were happening, and I was like, this is great. Yeah, and I still have all those resources. Justin like passed around a thumb drive basically and was like, everybody take all these resources and read them and explore them yourself, which is super cool. So I have those, which is awesome. Sounds really incredible. I just pulled out of the ferry and I parked, which is why my voice sounds kind of weird, because the engine's running, and they had me pull into this like tunnel thing, which is pretty cool. So I'm in this like tunnel. It's very cool. So then I get home. On the way home, actually, I buy this tape loom. So I buy this little tape loom, which, you know, you'll notice has been modified a little bit. And that's in my attempt to recreate everything that happened at Marshfield, but from barn size to this size, using whatever I can find. And that took me 1 year. And, you know, it might not have taken me so long. It might not have I not just been like a busy bee, but it took me a while. Because I'm gonna be honest, it was really hard. I'm not gonna sit here and be like, this was such a rewarding, and it was rewarding. I'm not gonna sit here and be like, this was, you know, the easiest, like, this was not a Lego puzzle. There were no instructions. I basically had to take what resources I got at Marshfield and be like, how can I apply these to like a -100 scale using none of the tools that you had. So one of the first things I needed to do was recreate very tiny knitted heddles, which, as you can see, are under the stress of my poorly warped warp threads here. Firstly, I needed to make a jig, because you can't knit the heddles without a heddle jig to hold them in place. Because all that it is, right, is just 2 strips of wood with space measured out, because you basically have so many heddles per inch, right? And obviously mine were not going to be perfect. But I was like, okay, well, I need a heddle jig. So I tried reaching out to some people and being like, hey, this is kind of what I need, but tiny. And they were like, that looks really complicated. I was like, no. It's not that complicated. So I ended up just making it myself. With a nail gun and some scraps of board. And my stepdad's help. Shout out to Rob. He cut all the pieces for me. He was like, I think that these match the measurements you sent me, but it didn't make any sense to me. And I was like, you and everybody else I've tried to talk to you about this. Because it sounds kind of insane and nonsensical. Because if you look at the pictures of the jig, and I say I need that but tiny, you're gonna be like, that's not really possible. But it is, I promise, because I made one. And I know what you're thinking, wow, that's really ugly. Yes, but it's somewhat functional, which is what I needed. And then came the really difficult part, which was the actual knotting. Oh my god, dude, when I tell you this took me freaking forever to figure out. Because I had like some info from Marshfield and I had the... Guess whose phone died an hour into recording? I did not notice and kept talking for like, I don't know, 20 minutes. So anyways, where were we? That's right. Talking about the heddles. So I finally get the heddle jig made, the heddle set up. And again, this is usually a very complicated process with like, usually two people. You can do it with one, but usually two people across the thing with specific tools for knitting. I had spools of thread and will, so I kind of just started going at it, and honestly it took me forever. It took me forever because I kept failing and I kept messing up, and it was really like intimidating. So I think part of me was just scared to go at it, I guess. It took a lot of analyzing, you know, these diagrams that Justin provided and that sort of thing. But honestly, once I got a handle on it, I was flying. It was actually quite soothing, but I really had to get into it first. So anyways, heddles are set up, right? Attached, as you can see. Part of one of them is made of 3D printed material because I lost part of one of them. Not sure what happened there. So my next step was to figure out the warp. So I made this little warp board here using some dowels, wood glue, and a wooden board. And I was like, this is perfect. It's the perfect pattern. It'll work great. And I figured out a really great, again, it also took lots of trial and error, if I'm being honest, to figure out the proper warping pattern. And also making a very ramshackle warping, what's it called? The thing with the thread spools in it that I was able to pull from, which works really well with thread spools, right? They spin really easily for the most part. I was able to get a good warp going. And then it fell apart in the process of getting it on loom, the first one. And I tried to still weave with it, didn't go so well. So I made fabric. That's right. It's I think couture level. By couture level, I mean it's literally freaking falling apart. Fabric. And no, my cat did not cough that up. She's flawed, but I love her anyways. So yeah, obviously, first attempt at making cloth on my tiny loom was, dare I say, a failure? Cover your ears, darling. A failure. Because what the heck is this? Anyways, I've been keeping it in a plastic bag because I don't trust it to hold together on its own. So issues, diagnostics. What can we say? Firstly, warp board, too small. That warp was not long enough, and I you know, I wish I'd recorded this before I took most of the warp off, but I did cut it down so I can get the fabric off. But as you can see, it's masking taped in place because the warp was too short. It couldn't reach end to end while still threading through, which was kind of my main problem, if I'm being honest. And so because of that, it was really hard to get things evenly spread, which is why you kind of have like the weird separations there. So then that led me with a dilemma, because I don't have another, you know, larger sized board that I can just like pull out and, you know, fix up as a warp board, because fortunately I have a shortage of loose plywood boards lying around. I just had that one. And then I had an idea. But first, you need to respect the fact that my room is messy. I don't want to hear it. I'm a very busy woman. I'm doing this. I've got my senior seminar paper, and I've got my recital, and it's eating me alive. Anyways, so I'm gonna get this de-threaded, and then I'm gonna show you the bright idea that I had that will hopefully work, and then hopefully we're gonna get this thing warped. Okay, so I got my little thread thing set up. I'm only gonna do 4, and I'm just gonna wind it around like twice. But what I'm gonna use is my dresser. because, and I'll insert like a picture here of what my warp board, the smaller one, looked like. It's like the same, I'm sticking a dowel there, ignore that. I'm gonna like, you know, wind it up here, and then cross beam here, loop it back around. I think it'll work all right, and then it'll be long enough, because this is a whole dresser size, to stick on the loom, hopefully. This is my bonkers little setup I've got going on here. This is taped to my camera stand, and then boom, warp. I think this is all I'm gonna do for now, because I want to just like see if I can work with just a really small amount of thread. Keep it simple. And so I rewarped, and I used some dowels pulled together and kind of tied together as cross sticks. Usually it's, the problem was I couldn't find anything loose, particularly the width, the weaving loom, and so I was kind of improvising a little bit, as I am with this whole process. That ended up working a lot better. So I ended up trying out warping on my dresser drawers, and it actually worked pretty well. And I created this. So here we have my first successful textile. As you can see, it looks a little bit like a worm. I was playing a little bit with the tension throughout, which is why some parts look slightly different than the others. It's a very fine weave because I was working with sewing thread. Honestly, it's beautiful. I'm very proud of it. So that was sort of a win, I'd say. Overall, like, that is a successful piece of textile. It holds together on its own. So I was really excited about that. I'm very pleased with how it looks, honestly. I think it's really cool. Oh, I forgot to mention another thing that I ended up adding on. In case you can't see, this spiky bit here at the end made of like dowels and a paint stirrer that's like physically done. I know this whole thing looks really janky. You gotta bear with me here. And I am going to make the claim that it is historical that I was improvising so much with what I had. Because if you think about it, this is honestly what a lot of people like my ancestors would have had to do. You don't just automatically have the tools, you know, even if you have the training, you don't automatically have the tools. And when you're trying to figure things out, when you're trying to figure out what practice works best, it's going to take a lot of figuring stuff out. Granted, they didn't have masking tape and paint stirrers, but they had their equivalent, right? What that is basically to hold the threads in place in order, you know, of the pattern which I warped them in, so that when I'm pulling them through the heddles and through the beater, they maintain their order and don't get twisted, because if the threads get twisted, they'll break and causes weird tension, which you'll see in my wool sample in just a second. So anyways, that was really helpful, even though it looks really, really terrible, right? And I was like, all right, time to work with the wool. And so the big challenge for this was that all my wool was in skeins, like this, or, you know, like this. And so it's like, how do I get this onto something spool-like that will spin as I pull it into a warp? And the problem is the exact things that we used at Marshfield were like all like antique or like not common practice chains. So I was like, I'm gonna have to figure something else out. And I tried figuring it out with like boards and other things, but I was like, I need a Swift, I need a yarn winder, I need something that will hold the skein in place while I wind it. And I had a friend who knits who lent me a Swift and a yarn winder, which is super kind of her, super awesome. Unfortunately, because it's made for modern knitting, crocheters, that sort of thing, it winds into cakes, which are these, right? As opposed to just, you know, being something that I could wind onto a spool, which like I probably could have if I configured it, but again, it was a borrowed tool. I didn't want to I wasn't gonna mess with it, right? So I was like, okay, I can work with cakes. I can work with this. And in theory I could, but you'll see in the video. Now you may recall that when I experimented with warping and successfully getting a piece of fabric, I had this with spools of thread set up in it so they would pull smoothly and warp. These obviously aren't on spools of thread. I have my wool here. They're just in skeins, which means I need a way to get them from skeins into spools. Problem being, when we did this at Marshfield, or at Newbury is what they're called now, we had this whole setup of like tools and stuff, this little wheel and this thing that would fit the spools on, and then wind it, and there would be, it's called a Swift. It looks, actually, hang on. I've been lent a Swift by a friend of mine who was very lovely enough to lend me that. So it would go on something like this, basically. These are going to wrap around. They like untwist and then wrap around. And then with the historical method, you would kind of like just hook it up to a thing and then spin, and this would hold the yarn and spin it as it winds onto a thing. But I don't have that setup. What I do have is what my lovely friend lent me, which is a normal yarn winder that people use nowadays. So what this is going to give me is like yarn cakes, basically, that you would see people knitting with just like normally nowadays. My only concern is that once I take it off of this thing, this like is obviously wider than these spools are, right? And so my only concern is that they'll end up being, I'll have to make them really small cakes so that they don't like run into each other, because this works really well for me and I don't want to try and scale this up at this point in the project. So my only thing is I'm just gonna have to watch that size and like hope it still works. It might not pull as smoothly, but I'm hoping it'll still pull together. Okay, I love doing this. This is so soothing. Okay, so what I decided to do, I've got my first cake here. Hopefully this isn't too big. That would be really annoying. And so I put it on, hang on. I glued these straws to these like pieces of cardboard basically. And I'm hoping that it being kind of like on something will, one, help the center of like the thread cake not collapse in on itself, but also help it spin better while I'm warping. Because I think if I just stick that in the warping board, it's just gonna get caught on everything and be like a total mess. But I think if I put it, you know, on a straw, that'll hold as like a smooth, you know, frictionless thing against the bamboo skewers that I've got on my warp board. This is such a crazy setup. Sorry. What am I doing? It'll spin a lot smoother, and then having that thin cardboard base to spin on will also help it a little bit. So that's just hot glue and straws. But yeah, so I think that looks pretty good. Hopefully it'll work well. So I've got 4 cakes spun. I think that's what I'm going to stick with, is 4, because it works well for the pattern and I can do it in a way where I can see the colored threads and follow the pattern once it's warped and make sure that I'm doing it in the right way. Dude, I tried this. I don't know what happened. Somehow in the process of trying to unwind it, this is demolished. Like, I can't find an end here. These are all the scraps of like, it started tearing into pieces and like, I don't know what, like I kept pulling chunks out of it and I was like, oh, I've ruined it. So that is going to be used for weft and not warp, unfortunately, because I love this color. But I had a 2-tone one that is going to give me this nice chocolate brown color. And then I've got these, so yeah. Hopefully it fits in the warp board. And I sure hope it works. And by hope, I mean it has to, because it's physically hot glued in place like that. But it seems to pull evenly. I mean, it will once it's like physically attached to something. Obviously right now, you know, this cardboard box doesn't hold up on its own, but I'll set it up like I had the last time and this should work. So when I did get the warp, it was not as clean as when I was working with sewing thread, which was unfortunate, right? Because this was supposed to be like the textile. That was supposed to be like my big final thing. But I was like, it's okay, you know, things happen. Nothing is going to be perfect. It's gonna be messy, right? Sure it was. So I get it warped successfully, and it's just a tangle. It's just a tangle. And I you know, again, I was able to get it to work and to weave with it. Do you remember how I mentioned in the beginning when I was talking about spinning how wool is incredible to spin with because it sticks to itself? It's also kind of horrible to work with because it sticks to itself. And so, you know, I'm trying to like detangle it and like get it to lay flat in this pattern so that I can like see it and get it through the knitted heddles and through the beater and, you know, wrap around the cloth beam in the same pattern that it, you know, came from the back end of the loom. And it just keeps like twisting in on itself, and I'm like, oh my god. And part of it is the fact that I don't have a proper warp board, and it's because it got all bunched together on the drawer pulls that I was using, which again works in a pinch, but not functionally enough to not cause problems later on down the line. So much of weaving is like, if you have problems at the beginning of the fiber preparation process, you're gonna have problems with the cloth. Dude. So, you know, I expected to have something imperfect, but I think just due to the nature of the stretchiness of the wool, I mean, it was pulling, it was stretching, the tension wasn't right. It was like half loose on one side and like nice and tight on the other side, so it looks a little wonky. And I was able to weave with it for a little bit, but then the threads started breaking. Because I think that my warp was a little bit too tangled. I did end up with a completed cloth. No, it's not a cloth. With a textile. With a woven bit of textile, as you will see here. This was my wool textile that I was able to get. As you can see, the tension played a big role, which is why this part looks a little stretched out and then this part looks a little bit more finely packed. It was just due to the way that, you know, this side was a little bit twisted, and so the tension got impacted and it made the wool not really behave how I wanted it to. But all in all, I'm pretty proud of this. I would have made it a lot longer, but the wool started snapping and I physically had to stop here. But I don't know, it's cool, you know? I'm proud of it. So yeah, I mean, like, is it perfect? No, but I mean, considering all the work and study that I did to get to this, I'm proud of it. You know, I think that it's kind of incredible that I started with like an idea and a thought of like, I want to learn about this, and I ended up being able to, you know, put these practical studies into practice using some modern technology and some historical methodology, and was able to get it to function. So yeah, I'm proud of that, and thank you so much for watching. This is gonna be a long video, I just know it.